Okay, here we go then. Hello everyone, and thanks very much for tuning in. So I'm Liz Murray. I work for Global Justice Now here in Scotland. We're part of the Trade Justice Scotland Coalition, and I've been working on stopping trade deals from TTIP onwards, but now in particular looking at post-Brexit trade and how to get a democratic and transparent process for post-Brexit trade deals. So doing a webinar is a bit of a new thing for us and an experiment. So we really hope it works, and we hope that you'll find it useful. So what's coming up is that you'll be hearing first from Jean Blaylock, who's from War on Want, and also they're also part of the Trade Justice Movement, UK-wide coalition, and me as well, on details of what should be included in a properly transparent and democratic process for the UK's trade deals with other countries. So Jean's going to give a UK-wide perspective, and I'll be chipping in with the perspective of the devolved administrations and Scotland in particular. So what this isn't is a kind of introduction to a trade campaign. So it will be quite detailed and perhaps a little bit geeky in places. So most of the things that we'll be talking about and suggesting are things that we'd like to see included in the UK government's trade bill, which is going through the UK Parliament at the moment, and which the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly will be asked to give their consent for. And we're doing this now because we really care about what's going to be in that bill, and we are very much focused on trying to ensure that written into the bill is are all the things that we're going to be talking about to do with democracy and transparency and parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals. So if you want to ask questions or make comments along the way, then there's several ways you can do that. You can log into YouTube if you have a login already, and you can add your questions and comments on the right-hand side of the page. You can probably see that as you look at the YouTube broadcast now. If you don't have a YouTube account, you can email your questions to us at thorn.house@globaljustice.org.uk, and we've put that email address on the right hand side of the page as well, or you can message us on our Global Justice Now Scotland Facebook page. We'll gather together the questions, and we'll answer as many of them as we can, either as we're going along or at the end, and you can add your questions and comments anytime that you want to. Excuse me. So okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Jean.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk through some of the characteristics that we've been saying to MPs and parliamentarians in Scotland and in Westminster about what should be just in a standard modern approach to negotiating and putting together a trade deal. None of these things are hugely radical or different. It's largely just that the UK's approach to doing trade hasn't been updated for 40 years. It hasn't had to be. And in those 40 years, trade deals have become a lot more far-reaching and touch on a huge number of areas of public policy that they never used to when they were much smaller things back in the 70s. And it's as though, I mean, it's basically as though we haven't updated the plumbing for 40 years, and we just need to put in place some basic procedures. So I'm going to go through sort of things that we think should happen before negotiating a trade agreement, during the negotiations, at the end of the negotiations, and then a small part about afterwards. And in each part, there are things that we think are needed just generally nationally, and then there are some particular things that are about the way that the devolved administrations, including Scotland, should be able to be part of the process. So to begin with, before negotiating a trade agreement, these are things that we really think that should be actually happening at the moment, because the Department of Trade is already effectively, they've set up various working groups with different countries and having trade talks with a whole range of countries. They're not formal negotiations yet, but they're already getting into effective negotiations. And there are certain steps that we think just should basically be being followed beforehand. The first one is to conduct an impact assessment to inform the decision as to whether the negotiations should actually start, because we believe that, you know, there are some situations, there are some countries where there are such serious human rights abuses that we shouldn't be even thinking of starting a trade agreement with them. There are some situations where I think if you do an impact assessment and you look at the whole range of impact on social effects, including health, education, economic effects, will this actually lead to job creation, or is that not actually likely to happen? Human rights situation, environment situation, effect on climate, the labour and the gender impacts. If you're looking at all of these things, it should inform you as to whether we actually want to do a trade deal, whether a trade deal is the right thing, and if so, what type of trade deal. So that kind of impact assessment should be carried out. It should be done independently, and it needs to be published. So, for instance, with the EU-Canada trade deal, an impact assessment was done about 10 years ago, and now that the deal has been signed and finalised and is being provisionally implemented, the UK government has finally decided to actually publish it. What should happen is that the impact assessment happens, it's published, and then that can inform a decision as to whether the trade deal should go ahead. Part of that impact assessment should include consultations with members of the public and community groups and others, environmental organisations, labour unions, any groups who are likely to be affected by the deal. I actually believe that this issue of public consultation should probably happen twice. First, you should probably ask people for input to the impact assessment, and then once everybody can see what the impact assessment is, there should probably be a consultation period. But in some way, there needs to be a public consultation, and that should probably be being done both by the UK government and by the devolved administrations. Once the information is actually there and available, and there is evidence to base a decision on, and if the decision is that yes, a trade deal should go ahead, then we believe that the Parliament should be able to set a mandate for the trade deal. So this would be the boundaries, some red lines, we want you to negotiate this, but we don't want you to go into there. For instance, we don't want you to include public services, or we don't want you specifically to include the NHS, or we do want you to include things that help promote renewable energy. So all of those sorts of things could be included in the mandate, which would then set the guidelines for the negotiators, and they would know from the start what Parliament thinks is important, what Parliament is worried about, where they think the risks lie. So those are basic steps that we think should happen before starting a trade deal. Liz, do you want to say something at this point?
Yes, just so I can just be brief on this. So the impact assessments obviously need to include, you may have mentioned this, Jean, but all parts of the UK, so that we can see, and in an ideal world, actually, the Scottish Government would do some impact assessments of its own in some detail for Scotland, and the same. If I say Scotland here, you can assume I mean the other devolved parts of the UK. So yes, so that there would be that we'd need. Then we are suggesting that a joint ministerial committee on trade should be set up, and that should have representatives of all the devolved nations in the UK, and that committee should be required to reach a consensus on any draft negotiating mandate. So they should obviously have access to the mandate before the negotiations start, and they should achieve consensus before it. Then the mandate then goes to the parliaments, to Westminster, but also to the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh and Northern Ireland assemblies. And if the mandate changes during the course of negotiations, then it should come back to those parliaments. And we're also suggesting that the consent of those parliaments and assemblies should be secured, because so not just consulted, but they should be allowed to give their consent, because of course, even though trade is reserved, as a policy matter, the impacts of trade deals are very, particularly these modern trade deals like TTIP and CETA, are very far-reaching and go into areas with potentially quite serious impacts, or certainly with big differences in their impacts across the UK, into areas of policy that are devolved, like farming and food, the environment, health, public procurement, public services. So it's a big swathe of areas of policy that they can have an impact on. So that's our kind of rationale for saying that the devolved nations should give their consent, not just be consulted. Jean, back to you.
Okay, so during the negotiations, a basic principle is that we think there should be a presumption of transparency. There's often a sort of a perception as though trade negotiations are like commercially sensitive business negotiations. They're not. They are public policy negotiations, just like any other area of international public policy debate that happens in the UN or other parts of international bodies. And we think that it's something that everybody should be able to see what's on the table, what is the latest state in the negotiations. One of the working groups that the Department of Trade has currently set up is with the United States. And towards the back end of last year, they had an exchange between the UK and the US, agreeing their approach to documents within those trade talks. And they said, obviously, everything will be secret unless we decide otherwise. And to me, that's just completely the wrong way around. Everything should be open and public unless there is a very good reason why it should be kept confidential. I recognize sometimes this may be the case, but in that case, that should be something that actively has to be done, to say there's a document here that we have withheld because it was sensitive. You can look, for instance, at the model of the way that perhaps the climate negotiations are conducted. Climate negotiations are something that is definitely not less important than trade negotiations. If the climate negotiations can be done in a more open and transparent way, then trade can be also. And in climate, it's common for the latest state of the text to be made available before each negotiating round and after each negotiating round, so that people can see where things are at. That doesn't mean that you have to open absolutely everything up. It's not asking people to actually sort of be very public about your negotiating strategy. It's just, where are things at? This trend towards transparency is also what's happening in trade negotiations more broadly. The EU reluctantly and not entirely willingly, but after much criticism from civil society and others, is becoming more transparent. It will now release publicly its own text proposals before negotiations happen, and that's something that the UK could easily do. At the WTO also, when there are negotiations happening at the WTO, the proposals are made public so that people can see at least what's happening there. If there are things that the government doesn't, or the negotiators don't want to make completely transparent, then we believe that there should at least be, for parliamentarians, or at least a group of parliamentarians, they should be able to have full access, even if they're not completely public. The group of parliamentarians could well be some form of scrutiny committee within Westminster, and probably, as Liz will say, some equivalent within devolved administrations, that follows the process of negotiations and whom the negotiators keep in touch with and keep updated, because the parliamentarians would be the people holding the mandate, and the negotiators would be reporting back to them and saying, this is where we are at against the mandate that you gave us. Similar in the EU, the negotiators are required to keep the European Parliament informed at all stages of the negotiation and in sufficient time for their views to be taken into account in the next stage of the negotiation. So this is actually something where you could see that if that kind of back and forth was happening, then if things start to blow up, you could probably deal with it at a much earlier stage. Rather than at present, what tends to happen with trade negotiations is that they all happen in great secret behind closed doors. People worry about what's going on. Gets to the end, it turns out that people did have reason to worry, and then everybody has a big fight. Whereas actually you could probably resolve some of those things bit by bit on the way through. Some of them, it might not be possible. And you might still have to have the fight. Also, throughout the negotiations, we believe there's a need for civil society consultation, so consultation with, again, community groups, environment groups, unions, and of course, there would probably also be consultation with business. So those are things that I think should be going on during the negotiations. Liz.
Okay. So we had a question just now come in from loyal viewer Bob. He's asking whether the devolved parliaments should be able to make amendments to the negotiating mandate, not just give their consent. So I would say yes, they should be able to. I was going to just double check with Jean whether, from a UK perspective, we obviously are suggesting that the UK Parliament should be able to amend the mandate. So Jean's nodding, so I would say yes, we should. The Scottish Parliament, from the perspective, I think we would say here, of the impacts on the areas of policy that are devolved. So in the same way that they have to give their consent, they're being asked, for example, with the trade bill, to give their consent about it relating to specific areas or specific things within the trade bill that are that fall within their sort of their legal remit, if you like, of the Parliament up here. Also then, just to add to what Jean was saying a minute ago about the role, to add something about the role of the devolved nations during negotiations, the first thing we would ask for or suggest is that there should be a negotiator from each of the devolved nations on the UK negotiating delegation trade deals. And that, are you seeing, is everybody seeing Jean, not me? Anyway, I'm trying to swap it around so that you can see me and not Jean, but I'm not succeeding at doing that. Anyway, and that is something. If you look at the example of Canada, they have members of the provinces. You can see members of the provinces. There are members of the provinces who are on the negotiating delegation. We're also suggesting that members of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh and Northern Ireland Assemblies should have a legal right to see the negotiating texts, and committees in the Parliaments and Assemblies should be given a formal role in scrutinising those negotiating texts, again from the perspective of the impact they may have on devolved powers and territories. So I'm going to hand back to you, Jean, to carry on.
Okay, so once the negotiations are finalised and there is a text there and the negotiators think it's fine, then they bring it to be signed and ratified. At the minute, there is no way for Parliament to actually say no. The ratification process that goes to Parliament is more of a rubber stamp procedure, and the text of the agreement is laid before Parliament for a certain number of days. If nobody objects, then it's ratified. There isn't actually a procedure in place for people to object, but even if people could find a way and a mechanism of objecting, then all that the government has to do is wait a certain amount of time and then bring the text back and say that they nevertheless want to proceed. And they can do this a repeated amount of time, and at each time it would be possible to have to jump through an awful lot of hoops in order to say no. So basically you could keep palming it back until you get the answer that you wanted. So we don't think that that kind of process is appropriate for a major piece of legislation like a trade deal, which, as Liz was outlining, affects a huge range of areas. We think it should just straightforwardly, when it comes to Parliament, there should automatically be a vote. It should be what's called a super affirmative vote, is one parliamentary term, which would still mean that Parliament can propose changes. So if they wanted to, they could say, well, it's all fine except this bit about the NHS, and we want you to change that bit. This would then mean that apart from anything else, the negotiators would have a very strong incentive to have made sure before they did this that this was actually something that Parliament was going to be happy with, which would then, again, hopefully improve the whole negotiating process and the openness and the transparency. That need to have a vote is the thing that would make a lot of the rest of the procedure meaningful. I think it is a most basic requirement, and it seems very simple, although of course we are at the minute watching Parliament debate in the different contexts of the withdrawal bill whether Parliament gets a vote on that. But simply for Parliament to have a vote on the trade deal seems a very basic necessity in a modern democracy. There is one small other area that we have raised. It's a bit slightly unrelated, but quite often during the process of trying to negotiate a trade deal, if there is a sector, a manufacturing sector or similar, where people realize, well, this group is probably going to lose out. Maybe they think farmers are probably going to lose out for this deal. And often politicians will, in the process, promise, oh, but we will bring in some package of measures, some package of compensation, of retraining, of opportunities that will help those people. But then magically the trade deal gets passed and those measures never come along. So we would like to say that if that has been said, and that's part of the logic ostensibly of the trade deal, then those measures should be passed at the same time as the trade deal. That's probably a bit hard to ensure, but it is something that I think is worth raising. Liz.
Okay. At the end of the negotiations, or in Scotland we have, and in Wales, and if there were a parliament or an assembly in Northern Ireland, there's a process called the legislative consent process, which activists here in Scotland, if you're tuned in, you'll know about, I'm sure. And that's where the Scottish Parliament goes through a process of scrutiny of things in UK primary legislation that will need some sort of secondary legislation in Scotland to help enact them, and that have an impact on areas of devolved policy. It's difficult to, at the moment we're suggesting that legislative consent process should be used in relation to any trade deal, this final trade deal, so that the Scottish Parliament gets a chance to look at it in some detail from its own devolved perspective and decide to give or withhold consent. We do recognise, though, that it's a pretty it's got its limitations, to put it mildly, and so it's potentially a bit of a blunt instrument. And actually, the whole Brexit thing is testing at the moment that aspect of the devolution settlement as to whether the the legislative consent motion, legislative consent process is up to the job, because of course it's not legally binding. So the Scottish Government has withheld its consent, the Scottish Parliament, sorry, has withheld its consent for various aspects of the EU withdrawal bill, and is very likely to be ignored. So we realise that's not ideal, but at the moment, kind of for political pragmatism, we're calling for that because it's kind of all we've got. So then we should, yes, Jean and I need to check questions that are coming in. Jean, did you see that question? What are the measures to compensate and help injured sectors adapt? So we're just going to, I'm going to give it back to Jean to answer a question about what kind of things might be compensated for. Is that what the question means? I hope so, if I've understood that correctly. So.
I mean, the question, what are those measures to compensate and help injured sectors adapt called? I mean, this is part of often nobody ever gets as far as making them anything tangible. They're often just things that politicians will refer to casually in a speech. I don't think that this is probably the most vital area at this particular point in the trade bill process, and it can also be a bit controversial, because equally, if you think, for instance, that your farmers might be wiped out by a trade deal with Australia and a trade deal with New Zealand, then maybe you shouldn't be doing a trade deal with Australia and New Zealand that includes agriculture. So there are also strong arguments against sort of thinking that you can compensate people, but on other occasions, sorry, Liz, Jane is saying that we need to switch presenters, but it tells me that I'm presenting. So maybe there's a time lag.
Yeah, there's nothing else I can do, I don't think.
Okay, sorry. These are the teething issues as we do our first attempt at doing this process. Yeah, but it's not that there's a standard set of measures or that they have a standard name. It's just that people do tend to sort of try and promise that they will do something, but then they don't actually deliver. Liz, shall I go on to talk about after the trade deal and the review process? Is that so? That this is just the last stage, that we think that after the trade deal, a trade deal has, if it's acceptable and it's a good trade deal, and it has been voted through, if it then comes into force, it should include a review clause that makes it easy to assess what actual impact is it having now that it's there. Are there any unexpected, unintended consequences? Are there any problems? And if so, is there a need to change or even withdraw from the agreement if necessary? At the minute, withdrawing from an agreement carries high penalties, whereas I think we feel that if you can show that there is damage being caused, then it should just be part of the normal process to say, well, we put this in place 10 years later. Actually, we don't think that it's working. Also, I've thought of one other thing, Liz, that I just wanted to, I should have said earlier, when I was talking about during the negotiations, and I mentioned the need for consultation. If you're talking to parliamentarians or responding to the inquiry on this, people will very often try and pigeonhole everything that we are saying into, oh, you want consultation. Whereas actually, as I was saying, things that would make the most significant difference are transparency and the parliamentary accountability, a mandate at the start and a vote at the end and scrutiny in between. Because, I mean, consultation, government is very good at saying, oh, we consulted, and now we're going to do what we were going to do anyway. Whereas the other processes that we are outlining are the processes that could actually require a change in the way that we do our trade deals. And if we really change, then consultation could become more meaningful. But if the only thing that we got was consultation, we probably wouldn't see any change from the way that we've been doing trade deals in the last 15 years or so. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, Liz. Liz, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sure you can, yes. Sorry, I've unmuted myself. Just a quick, one little bit to add to what you were saying about after the negotiations and there being a review from a devolved perspective. Of course, we would want the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh and Northern Ireland Assemblies to be included in those reviews so that they had the chance to assess the impact of those trade deals some years down the line on the things that are devolved to the areas of policy and their own powers as well, and to be able to propose changes or even recommend, as you said, the UK Parliament should be able to as well, to recommend to the UK Parliament that the UK withdraw from an agreement if necessary. And another question came in along the way that I just have been hanging on to. I wasn't sure quite where to slot it in, but I think actually it relates to some of the earlier stuff about transparency. Again from Bob, saying we've heard a lot with regard to the Brexit negotiations about the weakness, in inverted commas, of a system whereby the UK government made public its negotiating position in advance. And I guess he's asking how that, since we're asking for transparency on a trade deal negotiating position in advance, what would we say about that? So, Jean, I'm going to just bounce that back to you.
I mean, I've actually heard the reverse, that the EU was in a much stronger position because well, apart from the fact that it did a lot of preparation a lot earlier, it got a mandate from the Parliament and the Council, and the negotiators can very clearly say, this is our mandate, this is what we have to achieve. And then they have been putting out their papers as to what they are asking for much earlier, which then makes it much, to me, what I've seen is that putting them in a much stronger position, because they are saying, this is where we have to go. Whereas the UK has actually been following a much more secretive procedure where they will not say what they want. I mean, I think for far too long they had no position papers, and they were still just saying Brexit means Brexit. And that means that they could be pushed a lot further back because they hadn't gone through. When the EU is saying, well, we have worked with the Council and with the Parliament and with all the member states, and we have come to our position, and our position is this, and it's public, and we've said it in public, so we can't back down on it now, and you're going to have to meet us at that position. I think that's been a big advantage for them, to be quite, it's given them a stronger position, not a weaker position for doing that. That's the way that I've seen it.
Thank you. So I don't see any more questions having come in the meantime. So I was just going to finish off by mentioning that, which I'm going to guess people will know already, but that from the point of view of a lot of the stuff that we've been describing, so, there is an amendment to the trade bill already that's gone down in Caroline Lucas's name, Amendment NC3, which has a good deal of cross-party sign-up, including a lot of MPs from Scotland, and the SNP en masse signed up to that. So that may well come forward as part of the trade bill process. We're still unsure, because the trade bill is so very linked to the EU withdrawal bill. It's still not completely clear when it will come back to the Parliament report stage, but the latest rumours are that it may come back in the middle of July. Oh, and Bob says, Jean, that he agrees completely. That's good. Okay. And then the other thing to mention to you, which again you probably already know, is that the International Trade Committee is having an inquiry at the moment into this whole issue of transparency and scrutiny of trade policy and of course trade deals, and has a deadline of the 22nd of June. So if as a result of hearing this, you feel like you might be able to put in a consultation response, or if you'd like to, but you would like more details to help you do that, first of all, you can, to find out what the questions are, if you Google International House of Commons International Trade Committee, you'll get inquiry, you'll get taken to the page and you'll see the list of the different inquiries they've got. I think this one is at the top, but anyway, look for the one that's about scrutiny of trade policy. And you'll see there's about 5 questions. You don't have to answer them all to be able to put in a response. But you can contact, well, you have our email address here for Global Justice Now in Scotland. You can contact us to ask for help. And if you've come to this webinar via War on Want and you have Jean's contact details, you can contact her, or we can pass people on to Jean. I'm just going to pass quickly back to Jean in case there's anything else you want to finish off by saying as well, Jean, and then we can probably sign off. And we can also put this onto YouTube as a video afterwards, which I'll probably not want to watch myself. But anyway, I'm going to quickly hand back to Jean now.
I don't have anything more particularly to add. Yes, the inquiry, I think, would be quite good. I have a feeling that quite a few of the MPs in the International Trade Committee are quite sympathetic. Not all of them, there are some of them who have very different views, but there are quite a lot of MPs there who I think would like to have people telling them things that they think anyway, and now that they would be quite pleased to be able to say, and we had a lot of responses to our inquiry that confirmed what we were thinking. So I would, and you don't have to sort of send something in long and detailed and formal. You can just send in something quite brief, if that's what you want to do. And our organisations, of course, will also be sending in submissions.
Okay, so just to say then, thanks very much, Jean, in London, for taking part. And to my colleague Jane, who's up here hiding behind the scenes and has been writing, who worked out how to do this for us and has been passing us the questions and things. If you tuned in and you know us, let us know whether you thought this was useful and whether it, like technically, whether it worked and all that sort of thing, because it's very hard to tell from here. So anyway, there's probably some way you're meant to sign off on webinars, but okay, bye.